Undercover female officer promises romance if suspect confesses to notorious murder. Rachel Nickell case analysis.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to 48 Hours True Crime.
Today, we're taking an in-depth look at the murder of Rachel Nickell, the case featured in Netflix's documentary The Murder of Rachel Nickell. We'll begin with Rachel's background, walk through the timeline of the crime, and then examine one of the most controversial police investigations in British criminal history before I share my analysis. Rachel Nickell was born on November 23, 1968, and lived in London, England.
She was in a long-term relationship with Andre Hanscom, a motorcycle courier, and together they had a young son named Alexander, affectionately known as Alex. On July 15, 1992, Rachel, who was just 23 years old, took 2-year-old Alex and the family dog for a walk across Wimbledon Common, a vast public park in southwest London made up of open fields, wooded trails, ponds, and secluded pathways. Although surrounded by residential neighborhoods, parts of the common are remarkably isolated. As Rachel walked through one of these secluded areas, a man approached her from behind while armed with a knife. He launched an extraordinarily violent attack. Rachel was stabbed 49 times and sexually assaulted before being left to die. She did not survive. At the beginning of the attack, the killer pushed little Alex to the ground but otherwise left him physically unharmed. Tragically, the toddler witnessed most of his mother's murder. A passerby later discovered Alex clinging to Rachel's lifeless body while repeatedly pleading, "Wake up, Mommy." Police were immediately called. The investigation quickly became one of the largest murder inquiries in Britain, involving 54 detectives. Public pressure to solve the crime was enormous. Unfortunately, investigators had almost no physical evidence. There were no eyewitnesses besides Alex, and at only 2 years old, he was far too young to provide a reliable account. Nevertheless, police repeatedly interviewed him with the assistance of a child psychologist while his father remained present. Over multiple interviews, Alex consistently described the attacker as a young white man wearing a white shirt, blue trousers, brown shoes, and a belt worn over the outside of his shirt. Eventually, investigators realized his memories had reached their limit. His account became repetitive, offering no new information. Hoping to trigger additional memories, police brought Alex back to Wimbledon Common. The visit had the opposite effect. Alex became visibly traumatized and burst into tears. Seeing his son's distress, Andre immediately picked him up and left the scene. After that experience, Andre refused any further interviews involving Alex. Instead, he relocated with his son to France. Months later, Alex recalled one additional detail. The killer had removed the murder weapon from a bag before launching the attack. Meanwhile, detectives continued searching for leads. One woman reported seeing a suspicious man walking toward the murder scene approximately 10 minutes before the attack. Her description closely matched Alex's. A police sketch based on her account resembled a local man named Colin Stagg. Colin lived alone, regularly walked his dog on Wimbledon Common, and was widely regarded as an eccentric loner. During questioning, he admitted he had previously been fined for sunbathing naked on the common. Rather than treating this as unrelated behavior, investigators interpreted it as evidence of sexual deviance. Despite extensive questioning, however, they found nothing connecting Colin to Rachel's murder. The investigation took another turn when a woman who had corresponded with Colin through a Lonely Hearts Club contacted police. She described his letters as disturbing, vulgar, and deeply unsettling. After examining the correspondence, detectives became increasingly convinced that Colin fit their image of the killer. Seeking expert assistance, they consulted criminal psychologist Paul Britton, asking him to create a behavioral profile of Rachel's murderer. Britton concluded that the killer was likely a man in his 20s or 30s, living alone near Wimbledon Common, socially isolated, someone with failed relationships, fascinated by knives, experiencing sexually sadistic fantasies, interested in the occult, and likely to offend again. While presented as sophisticated profiling, most of these characteristics were fairly generic and could describe many stranger-on-stranger knife attacks. The only unusual element was the suggestion of an interest in occult practices.
Nevertheless, detectives became convinced Colin Stagg matched the profile.
This belief led to one of Britain's most controversial undercover operations. Codenamed Operation Edsel, investigators decided to manipulate Colin psychologically by exploiting his fantasies and encouraging him to confess. A female undercover Metropolitan Police officer was assigned the alias Lizzie James. Her true identity has never been publicly revealed. She wrote Colin a letter, pretending to be the friend of a woman who had previously corresponded with him. Soon afterward, she began portraying herself as romantically interested in him. Colin responded openly about his sexual fantasies, including fantasies involving domination and humiliation.
Detectives viewed these conversations as confirmation that Britain's profile was accurate. As the operation progressed, the two exchanged increasingly explicit letters, spoke frequently by telephone, and eventually met face-to-face. Lizzie repeatedly steered conversations toward Rachel Nickell's murder. Although Colin admitted to violent fantasies, he never admitted killing Rachel. At one point, Lizzie claimed she enjoyed hurting people. Colin appeared confused, replying, "Please explain. I live a quiet life. If I've disappointed you, please don't dump me." She responded with perhaps the most shocking line in the entire operation. "If only you had done the Wimbledon Common murder, if only you had killed her, it would be all right." Colin simply answered, "I'm terribly sorry. But I haven't." Despite his repeated denials, police insisted Colin had mentioned details only the real killer could know. They focused on his discussions about sex involving knives and blood on Wimbledon Common. On August 17, 1993, Colin Stagg was arrested. Investigators believed they had solved Rachel Nickell's murder. The case appeared closed. Less than 3 months later, however, another horrific crime shattered that assumption. On November 6, 1993, Samantha Bissett was brutally stabbed to death inside her London apartment. Her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine, was suffocated. The similarities between Samantha's murder and Rachel's were striking. Both victims were attacked while accompanied by young children. The obvious problem? Colin Stagg was already behind bars. He could not possibly have committed Samantha's murder. Investigators recovered fingerprints from Samantha's apartment that led them to Robert Napper, who was later convicted of those murders. Rather than reconsidering Rachel's case, detectives insisted 2 different killers were responsible. They refused to abandon their theory. On September 14, 1994, the trial judge delivered a devastating ruling. He declared that police had attempted to incriminate Colin through deceptive conduct of the grossest kind. Every piece of evidence gathered during the undercover operation was ruled inadmissible. Without that evidence, the prosecution collapsed. Colin Stagg was acquitted. Yet despite the court's decision, many officers continued insisting he was guilty, and public suspicion followed him for years. A decade later, advances in forensic DNA testing reopened the investigation. DNA recovered from Rachel's clothing matched Robert Napper. In 2007, Napper was formally charged with Rachel Nickell's murder. The following year, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. He suffered from schizophrenia and autism spectrum disorder. The judge ordered him detained indefinitely in a secure psychiatric hospital because he was considered an ongoing danger to society. Months before Napper entered his plea, Colin Stagg received £706,000 in compensation for his wrongful arrest. The Metropolitan Police also issued a formal apology. Analysis. Item 1. The wrongful accusation of Colin Stagg was only one of several catastrophic failures. Subsequent investigations revealed police had missed multiple opportunities to stop Robert Napper before he murdered Rachel, Samantha, and Jasmine. Back in 1989, Napper became a suspect in a sexual assault investigation after resembling a composite sketch. Police asked him to provide a blood sample. He agreed but never appeared. When officers returned, they discovered he had moved away. Rather than locating him, detectives abandoned the investigation because Napper was over 6 feet tall while witnesses estimated the attacker stood around 5'7". Even more astonishingly, Napper's own mother later contacted police, claiming her son had confessed to sexually assaulting a woman.
That information was never properly investigated. Item 2. Initially, investigators had understandable reasons to interview Colin Stagg. He resembled the suspect's sketch. He owned knives and survival equipment. His letters contained disturbing sexual themes. He had little social life. None of those facts, however, constituted evidence of murder. The investigation crossed the line once Operation Edsel began. One could reasonably argue that detectives were effectively offering romance and implicitly sex in exchange for a murder confession. At one point, the undercover officer literally suggested everything would be acceptable if Colin admitted killing Rachel. That sentence alone belongs in every criminal investigation textbook as an example of what investigators should never do. Beyond the entrapment concerns, detectives placed extraordinary faith in Paul Britton's behavioral profile. In reality, the profile contained little that wasn't common knowledge among experienced investigators. A criminal profile should generate investigative leads, not replace evidence. Unfortunately, detectives treated it less like guidance and more like absolute proof. Some observers have even suggested that the enormous popularity of The Silence of the Lambs, released only a year earlier, contributed to unrealistic expectations about criminal profiling. Hollywood made profiling appear almost supernatural. Real investigations are never that simple. Once police convinced themselves Colin was guilty, confirmation bias took over. Contradictory evidence was ignored. Alternative suspects were dismissed. The goal shifted from finding the truth to proving an existing theory. Item 3, the Netflix documentary. Overall, The Murder of Rachel Nickell presents the case clearly and in chronological order. It features interviews with several key figures, including Andre, Alex, Paul Britton, and Colin Stagg. The documentary also explores the emotional impact on Rachel's family, particularly the difficult decisions Andre faced regarding Alex's interviews and the long-term effects those choices had on their relationship. However, I believe the documentary missed an opportunity. The most important story isn't simply Rachel's murder. It's how investigative failures allowed Robert Napper to remain free while an innocent man became the focus of one of Britain's largest murder investigations. The film discusses Napper, but it doesn't fully explore the institutional failures, tunnel vision, confirmation bias, denial, and the abandonment of critical thinking that allowed those mistakes to happen. Perhaps the documentary's most important takeaway should have been this: murderers destroy lives. But when investigators become consumed by the wrong theory, they can unintentionally help those murderers continue killing while innocent people pay the price. Those are my thoughts on the tragic case of Rachel Nickell. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.